This week started on the road. Long drives, tight schedules, and 4 very different sites spread across the country. On paper, each job had a clear method. In reality, none of them stayed that way for long. This video is not a highlight reel. It's a week of compromises. Ice that breaks assumptions, rain that slows everything down, and one site where a routine survey had to be finished before a funeral. Welcome back to Tinkering with Jerd. The first site of the week is an industrial lot. The plan here was pretty standard. Use the drone for coverage with GNSS on the ground to back it up. A standard aerial topo. As usual, I start by setting the GNSS, heading onto site, and, well, I looked around. Ice, standing water, shiny surfaces everywhere. From a distance it looked fine, but from a photogrammetry point of view, this is a real problem. Ice and water cause issues for photogrammetry for a couple of reasons. First, they reflect light differently depending on angle, so the same surface can look completely different from one photo to the next. Second, they don't have stable texture. What looks like a solid feature in one image might shift, disappear, or change entirely in the next. The software is trying to match pixels across lots of images. When those pixels move, reflect, or change in appearance, the geometry starts to wobble even if the model looks okay at first glance. So I still went ahead with the drone survey, but I supplemented it with traditional survey. Going around, looking at my hard surfaces, my curves, my road lines, any hard features really, and capturing that with the GNSS, knowing that at the end of this I'm going to have to get into the point cloud and start digitizing to produce a topographic output. So as much information as I can gather, that's the goal. The drone survey came next, but cautiously, this isn't just a case of flying and hoping that the software sorts it out. You're already thinking about what the final output is going to look like and where it's likely going to struggle. I'm not going to do a deep dive into photogrammetry theory here because I've already covered that in a previous video. What matters for this site is recognizing when imagery can lie and planning around that. A lot of real work happened after capture, being selective with the data, cleaning things up early, and not forcing information into the model just because it exists. So as I go through and fly and start capturing the images that I need, I'm using a combination of mission planning and pilot 2, as well as just using my own judgment to know what's going to work and what's going to produce the best model at the end of it, knowing the conditions of the site. And, you know, truth be told, I was really chuffed with the output on this one because I spent a lot of time on site thinking about how I was going to capture the data and what it was going to look like and worrying about these reflections. And in the end, the model looks great. The model came together quite nicely, and yes, you know, while I'm on a live road and things are changing, the reality is this is going to be a great model to be able to digitize from. Yes, this is a 720p downsampled version from Enforce, where you're looking at a blobby little bit of a mess in some ways, but it is consistent, it is stable, it is a good model, and at the end of it, I'm chuffed. I'm going to be able to do a lot with it. And so the site came out well, but it was just the first challenge of the week. And so we head to the next one. The second site was a small pump track in London. Not a big site, but one where accuracy really mattered. It was raining steadily by the time I got there, which already makes everything feel a bit slower and heavier. Even though the site itself is small, the purpose of this survey raised the bar. The cut and fill analysis that was going to be used here was to plan and conduct the removal of buried asbestos underneath these mounds. So the first thing that really mattered was getting the ground control sorted, and making sure, especially the vertical control, was consistent and constrained. When you're dealing with remediation work, you don't get much tolerance for rough estimates. You need to know what material is being distributed and how much of it. The rain doesn't make that any easier. The ground is wet, surfaces soften, and subtle level changes are harder to read. And this is exactly where it's tempting to rush. You want to get the drone up, get the data, and get out of the weather. But this is the part you need to deliberately slow yourself down at. I spent time here thinking about where control actually mattered, how it was distributed across the track, and whether it really represented the surface I needed to measure. I'm already visualizing the final surface at this point. Not how it looks on the screen, but how it's going to behave when it's used for those calculations. Thinking about those sorts of things, you know, happens before the drone ever leaves the ground. Once the control was in and I was happy, the drone made sense. A traditional ground survey here would have been slow, fragmented, especially in the rain, and much harder to keep consistent across the whole track. I oversampled deliberately, more images than strictly necessary, knowing that some would be unusable in these conditions. In a situation like this, that isn't a waste, it's giving yourself room to be selective later. Back in processing, the images were treated as data, not footage. Anything affected by the rain, on the lens, glare, or reduced clarity was removed before reconstruction. And altogether, things turned out alright. I sent the drone up in the air, and yes, it was raining and started to get heavier and heavier the more time I was on site, but I had my mission planned. And through a combination, much like the previous site where I used Pilot 2 to plan out my mission beforehand, I also used a combination of my own experience on sites like this to capture more data than was strictly necessary. And once I had that data and I was confident, it was time to get out of there, process data, and the resulting model was this. It's consistent, predictable, and stable. For this site, that consistency is what makes the cut and fill defensible. It's what allows the remediation work to be planned properly before anything is disturbed on site. Even on a small site, the consequences of getting it wrong can be significant. This one was about slowing down early so the next stage can happen safely. And the resulting model is consistent. It looks good, the geometry is stable, and overall it is very accurate, and I'm chuffed to bits with how this all turned out despite the conditions around us. I can't say the same for the next site that we're about to head to, where, well, things had to be rushed and plans had to change very quickly. So let's get on. And so here we are, site number 3, a crematorium. And I planned to do this site traditionally. Head out with the GNSS, capturing curbs and road lines and bollards and trees and things like that. But it dawned on me very quickly that, well, A, there was just a lot of features on the site that needed to be recorded. B, the client had somewhat changed the scope of the survey. And C, and most importantly, there was a funeral plan for later that afternoon that necessitated I get out of there. And at that point, continuing with a purely ground-based survey stopped making sense. But what I had planned was to do a drone survey in the first place. I'd thought about the contingency and I thought I might have to switch tacks here a little bit. And so I had the RAMs in place, I had the mission planned, and so it was a matter of pressing go. And so I did. And while I don't have the footage of that, what I do have is the resulting model. And, well, not the cleanest model at the peripheries, that part of the site is not in the survey. Where it matters, certainly around these corridors and where I've got some bollards and the vegetation in the middle, things like that, that's where it really matters to have some supplemental information that I can extract from a point cloud like this. So I got a lot with the GNSS, heading around, capturing all the features and the covers that I needed to capture, and then with this I can supplement that, while making a note of it because that's important to say how the information was gathered in the first place. But in this instance, this is the power of photogrammetry. This is the power of photogrammetry, LiDAR, mobile mapping, where you're able to extract a lot of data very quickly and do it accurately. I still had the ground control, used existing features on the site to produce an accurate model at the end of it. And I'm happy with how it resulted, and I'm going to be able to make a nice topo at the end of this. Which leads me into site number 4, the hardest one yet. This final site was a measured building survey of an active crematorium. Combining a drone survey externally and SLAM scanning internally, the aim was to bring those two datasets together into a single model without interfering with the day-to-day operation of the site. That requirement dictated the entire methodology. The first thing I did here was set control externally across the site. This control was shared, it was used for the drone survey outside, and it was also the reference that everything inside would eventually have to tie back to. That decision had to be made right at the start. Once you're mixing drone data and SLAM data, you don't get to fix that later. If the control strategy isn't right, you don't end up with one model. You end up with two good datasets that don't quite agree, and that's worse than having one imperfect one. Only once that framework was in place did I start moving through the site. At this stage, I'm not scanning yet, I'm just walking. As I'm walking around here, I'm reading the building and the way it's used. this is an active crematorium. People are working, rooms are in use, and movement through the building isn't something I can control. So the capture has to fit around that. I couldn't place any control inside the building. That was a hard constraint, and a completely reasonable one. So everything internal had to be captured without fixed reference points, and then brought back to the external control later. SLAM is often presented as simple. You walk around and it just works. In reality, it only behaves nicely when you have clean geometry, good loops, and plenty of constraints. This building doesn't give you that. As I move from room to room, opening doors, passing through spaces, the amount of data builds up very quickly. Every doorway, every change in space, every turn adds more geometry that has to be kept under control. At this point, I already know what the difficult part of this job is going to be. It's not capture, it's the registration. So the internal capture was planned around that. Instead of long continuous scan, I broke it down deliberately. Short loops, one area at a time, knowing that everything would need to be registered carefully at the end. That means more work later, but it also means having better behaved data. I'm choosing control in processing instead of hoping SLAM holds together over long loops. This is where SLAM Scanner comes out. By this point, the approach is already set. I'm not experimenting. I'm executing a plan that was built up while walking the site. Each scan is treated as its own unit. I'm closing short loops where I can, but I'm not forcing it. I know that everything will need to be aligned carefully afterwards. At the same time, the drone is handling the external capture. I don't have the footage of that here, but its role is clear. Roofs, elevations, and overall building form all tied back to the same external control. The key to making this work is that both datasets start close enough. They don't need to be perfect, they just need to be a couple of centimeters in the right place, so fine registration can refine them later and rescue them if need be. This wasn't an engineering survey. The methodology didn't need to be millimeter precision everywhere. It needed to be sound. It needed to be repeatable and appropriate for an active building like this. This is the kind of job where you accept that processing will take time. You work through the registration carefully. You don't rush it. You make it work. And overall, the scan came out okay. Well, it came out better than okay because, well, yes, in places, certainly where there are overhangs, the drone point cloud here didn't exactly do the best job, but that was kind of the point because the SLAM scan could be used to consolidate portions of the model that didn't quite work. And in the end, after a process of fine registration and getting everything to merge, the resulting model looked like this. A fantastic, fantastic model. And so, looking back over the week, none of these sites exactly went to plan. Conditions changed, access changed, time windows closed. What stayed consistent was the need to adapt without cutting corners. Drones, GNSS, SLAM aren't solutions on their own. They're tools, and the job is choosing when and how to use them. Most of the work that you don't see happens before capture, and indeed after it. That's what makes the data usable in the end. And so, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and, well, I'll capture you in the next one.